Resident Evil Extinction, a novelization by Keith R. de Candido. Chapter 25. In the 1940s, Benjamin Siegel, a New York mobster who had moved to Los Angeles, decided to turn the small desert town of Las Vegas, Nevada, located in a state where gambling was legal, into the site of the greatest luxury hotel and casino the world had ever seen. The result of that dream, the Flamingo, was but the first, and by the end of the 20th century, Las Vegas had gained a deserved reputation as a place to gamble and gamble, easily earning the nickname of Sin City. That, however, was in the old world. If Alice hadn't seen the sign saying "Welcome to Las Vegas," and if the odometer of the 8x8 hadn't been 155 miles higher than it was after they passed the mile marker on the highway, she might not have believed the sign. Claire's voice sounded over the PRC and summed it up perfectly. Oh my God. Alice found herself recalling a poem she'd read in high school called Ozymandias by Percy Bysshe Shelley, about a kingdom that had been reclaimed by the desert, leaving only 2 legs from a statue erected to the long-dead king Ozymandias, the King of Kings. Aloud, she muttered a line from the poem, "Nothing beside remains." From behind her, Kmart asked, "Where is it?" "Guess the desert wanted it back," she said. Bits of Vegas were still visible over the sand dunes. The tops of the recreated Empire State Building, Statue of Liberty, Eiffel Tower, and the Sphinx outside the Luxor. Alice bitterly thought that the latter seemed a lot more appropriate now. She shook her head. 5 years of storms and no one to hold the sand back. Claire said, "Let's bring it to a stop, people." After the vehicles all came to a standstill, Carlos took out his binoculars and started gazing across what was left of the city. Over the PRC, Chase asked the question on everyone's mind. Where are they? After a few more seconds, Carlos lowered the binoculars. Nothing. Alice couldn't believe it. Not a single line of undead. That seemed impossible. Then she saw one of those crows that had menaced the convoy flying by. She pointed at it. Those birds must have moved through the city block by block, picked it clean. Carlos shuddered. Behind them, Kmart said, "Damn." "Let's move," Claire said. "Everyone be careful." Slowly the convoy moved down the sandy remains of the strip. Dead husks of palm trees lined the center divide. "There," LJ said over the radio. "The Pizza San Marco." "That's Piazza," Mikey said. "Whatever, man. They got valet parking and a gas pump in there." Alice peered ahead and saw that the Venetian was in better shape than some. You could actually enter the hotel, though the faux canals were choked with sand, the gondolas beached and useless. "How would you know that?" Chase asked. Having no trouble visualizing LJ's shrug, Alice heard him say, "Dropped 2 G's here back in the day." Chase's appreciative whistle sounded bizarre over the PRC speaker. $2,000, Mr. High Roller. Kiss my butt, cowboy. Alice turned to Carlos. "You know, it brings a sense of order to the world. Everything may have gone to hell, but at least LJ's still LJ." "I heard that, Abernathy. You'll get yours, girl, you feel me?" Grabbing the radio, Alice said, "Not in your wildest dreams, LJ." "Everybody stop!" Carlos slammed his foot on the brake at Claire's sudden order, and Alice lurched forward, the seatbelt biting into her ribs. Alice hopped out of the 8x8, Carlos right behind her, and ran past the Hummer. Claire had already gotten out, and Alice followed her gaze to the massive metal freight container blocking their path. "We have to move it," Alice said. Claire shot her a no-kidding look, then turned to Chase. who was just sticking his head out of the Unco tanker. "Chase, I want to look out." She looked over to the side of the road. They were right by the Eiffel Tower. "Up there." Alice couldn't help but smile at the crestfallen look on Chase's face as he stared up at the imposing height of the recreated Eiffel Tower. "Great." "Could be worse," Alice said. "This one's shorter than the one in Paris." "Rather be at the one in Paris right now," he muttered, then headed over to it. The 8x8, the tanker, and the news truck all had winches in the front, and they quickly pulled all three vehicles up to the container. It would take all three to move this thing. In fact, Alice wasn't 100% sure the three would be sufficient. But the ambulance and the Hummer didn't have winches. While Alice pulled out the 8x8's hook, Claire started unspooling the cable on the news truck, with Carlos taking the tanker. "Damn." Alice looked up to see Chase about halfway up the tower, shaking his hand back and forth. The metal was probably hot to the touch. After a second, he kept going. The three of them walked up to the container, a very unsteady LJ behind them, with his Beretta ready. Behind LJ were the other surviving adult members of the convoy: Morgan, Dorian, Cliff, Peter Michael, Pablo, Erica, and Joel. They were all armed and ready, too. With Claire, Alice checked the front of the container, but there was no sign of a handle or lock or anything. It was as if it was a sealed box. "No lock, no way to open it," she said to Claire. "Good," Claire said emphatically. From the sounds of it, she didn't want to know what was in it. "Now let's get this done." Just as Claire turned to hook up the winch, Alice heard a noise. Based on the way she suddenly stopped, Claire heard it too. She and Claire exchanged glances. Then Alice put her ear to the container. It definitely sounded as if something was hitting the container from the inside. Then she ducked as she heard an explosive noise. Looking up, she saw that it was a bolt flying off the front of the container, quickly followed by several more doing the same. "Get back!" Alice cried, just as the front of the container fell forward onto the sandy strip. She and Claire barely avoided being smashed by the front as it crashed to the ground. For a second, there was silence. The inside of the container appeared dark. Then all hell broke loose. Ever since she saw her first undead in the hive a lifetime ago, Alice had known that there were rules about them that they always followed. One was that they were incredibly slow. Indeed, the living's greatest advantage had always been speed. Powered only by electrical impulses being fed to dead tissue, there were limits on how fast they could ambulate. No longer. More than 30 undead poured out from the container, and they were moving at speeds Alice could barely keep up with, much less the others. Alice and Claire were closest, and one leapt right at them. Without hesitating, Alice blew it away with her sawed-off. She'd hoped to hit the head, but it moved faster than anticipated, and she only got him in the chest. Even with most of his thoracic region gone, the undead quickly got to his feet. "What the hell are these things?" Claire asked as she took aim. But these undead were too damn fast. They attacked. Alice got one with a clothesline across the neck that snapped bone. This time, it didn't get back up. That was something. They had the same vulnerabilities. Several convoy members took shots, but they weren't all as good as Carlos or Alice herself or Jill, whose marksmanship Alice found herself missing horribly right about now, and they couldn't seem to make headshots. "Run!" Alice screamed, not that she needed to tell anyone twice. Claire was heading for the Hummer, LJ and Carlos covering her. Alice ran and fought and shot. But there were so many of them. One literally ripped Morgan in half. Another punched Pablo, his fist going right through Pablo's chest, thrusting his heart out through his back. Two more grabbed Cliff's retreating form and pulled him to the ground, beating him into a bloody pulp. LJ barely made it into the 8x8 in time, slamming the door in an undead's face. The monster kept pounding on the door, putting huge dents in it, then went for the window. As it shattered, LJ screamed to the back seat, where Alice assumed Kmart still to be. "Get in the back!" First, Alice heard Kmart say, "Forget that!" Then she heard a distinctive pumping sound. Then she saw the undead get blown back out the window, following the report of a shotgun. Looking over at the Piazza San Marco, Alice saw Joel and Peter Michael being chased onto the Venetian bridge by 2 more undead. Alice ran after them, pulling out the kukris she'd taken from the guys in KLKB. She'd been looking forward to a chance to use these things. Her first swing sliced open one undead's arm. Her second, with the other one, carved into the other undead's neck, but wasn't a fatal blow. It was enough to get the undead to focus their attention on Alice instead of Peter, Michael, and Joel, however. They ran. Alice stayed and smiled at the undead. Carlos kept firing until both his .45s dry-clicked. He made sure that Claire got into the Hummer and that Mikey got into the news truck. When Peter, Michael, and Joel ran down from the Venetian Hotel, Carlos made sure they made it into the ambulance. Unfortunately, he hadn't been able to help Pablo, Cliff, or Morgan, and he couldn't see Dorian or Erica. Chase was still up the tower, and the occasional bullet from above meant that he was doing his part. The kids were all in the ambulance with Joel and Peter Michael. They were all safe. Carlos, however, wasn't. The undead that had been blown out of the 8x8 was now on Carlos, and his .45s were both empty. With no time to reload, he instead dove to the ground and rolled under the 8x8. Reaching into his ammo pouch with sweaty fingers, he kicked at the 2 undead who clawed at his boots. He let the empty clip fall to the ground and struggled to slam the full one into the barrel. One was right near his calf, opening its mouth to bite. Finally, Carlos slammed the clip in and fired on the undead, blowing his head off, then doing the same for the next a second later. He let himself breathe a sigh of relief. Turning his head, he saw another undead face snarling right at him, its decaying breath blowing right into his nose. Then it moved to bite him. Isaac stood in the tent they'd set up in what used to be Las Vegas. A helicopter sat next to the tent, ready to evac at a moment's notice in case anything went wrong. The last few years had taught Sam Isaacs that it was best to assume that the worst would happen, because all too often it did. With him were 2 of the people working under him whom Isaacs came closest to trusting, mostly by virtue of having overheard them say disparaging things about Slater. One was Kim Pinto, a technician who was adept with Umbrella's satellite network. The other was Dr. Howard Margolin, who'd supervised the mass production of the serum that had made these new creatures, and had also been aiding Isaacs with his other formula. He'd also been the one to coin the phrase super undead to describe them, a neologism that spread through the entire complex before Isaacs had had a chance to put a stop to it. Besides them were DeGennaro and Lobachevsky from Security Division. A pilot, Alan Kistler, was waiting in the helicopter, along with Perrineau from Security. In front of him, on one of the plasma screen monitors, Isaacs watched the satellite feed that showed the battle on the Strip. In another, he got what Pinto had referred to as Alice Cam. This was a direct view of what Alice was seeing, thanks to the implant that Isaacs had placed in her skull back in San Francisco before her escape. Below them were smaller monitors that provided various bits of data about Alice's health. Once they'd found Project Alice heading with Oliveira, Wayne, and 18 other survivors toward Las Vegas, it was a simple matter to place an obstruction on the only road that was still passable in that fabled city, the so-called Strip, where Project Alice and her compatriots were all but guaranteed to find it. And now they had. The super undead were performing beyond expectations. It was a pity that people had to die to test the super undead, but given Isaac's long-term goals, a smaller living population was preferred. Alice apparently had gotten her hands on some exotic weaponry in her travels. As he watched the two plasma screens, he saw her use a pair of Nepalese blades on two of the super undead. Or rather, try to. One blade became embedded in a super undead's shoulder, and the other one ducked a swing of Alice's. The follow-through resulted in the blade slamming into the wall of one of the vulgar hotels that used to dominate this metropolis, breaking off the blade's tip. Still, Alice fought on. Her heart rate, respiration, and EEG all remained at the same level they had been before the fight began. This wasn't much of an effort for Alice, or rather, even if it was, that effort wasn't taking a great deal out of her. Her heart rate was only a marginal percentage higher than it usually was, though that still made it far faster than normal, and her EEG remained stable. One super undead fell to the ground, and it took Isaacs a moment to realize that she'd beheaded the creature with her remaining blade. It had happened so fast that Isaacs had almost missed it. "She really is magnificent," he muttered. Then he turned to Margolin. "When she's dead, make sure you move in fast. I need a sample of her blood while it's still warm." Margolin nodded. Looking at the plasma screen, he watched Alice dispatch the other super undead. Then she retrieved her blade from its shoulder. Isaacs had seen enough. To Pinto, he asked, "Satellite in position?" "Yes, sir," Pinto replied. "Then shut her down." Pinto entered some commands into her keyboard. Seconds later, Alice stopped moving, her arms going limp, the blades dangling loosely in her weakened grip. Isaacs smiled. Mikey Fairburn knew, rationally, that no one could possibly think that the world was better now than it was. Most of the population of the United States was dead, as far as he'd been able to determine. The rest of the world was only in marginally better shape, and he had absolutely no idea from day to day if he'd have such basics as food and shelter. But he didn't exactly miss his old life, either. He worked as a computer programmer for a bank. True, he worked long hours, but at least the pay was dreadful. He was underappreciated at his job, and his social life would have had to have improved by several orders of magnitude before it would reach the lofty heights of pathetic. He'd been homesick with mono when the zombies started showing up in Tampa. By the time he recovered, everyone in his apartment complex was dead, and only the deadbolt on his door had kept him safe. The next living human being he saw was a woman named Jill Valentine, who offered to let him come along with her and the others she'd picked up throughout the Gulf Coast. They went down to Key West, then headed north. In Atlanta, Jill had met up with Claire and Carlos and dumped everyone off with them, saying she was sick of people. At first, Mikey had thought that he'd annoyed her too much, and admittedly, his attempts to hit on her were lame as hell. But she'd literally saved his life, and it was hard not to be grateful and smitten at the same time, especially with someone as amazing-looking as Jill. But Carlos had assured him that Jill had always been like that. He'd quickly proven his use to the convoy with his programming skills. For the first time in his entire life, he was appreciated, wanted, needed, and even liked. Pity it took the end of the world to happen. His love life hadn't gotten any worse. Not that there was anywhere to go from zero. If only those women who'd all told him they wouldn't date him if he were the last man on Earth were here now, he could call their bluff. That, however, was the least of his concerns right now. It had been bad enough dealing with all the zombies. At this point, Mikey had pretty much gotten used to them. But crows, and now these souped-up zombies? It was just wrong. Carlos had covered Mikey's retreat into the news truck. The kids had all been put in the ambulance, leaving Mikey alone in the truck, which suited him fine. He didn't say anything, but he'd never liked kids, and hadn't relished the idea of his truck, his refuge, his haven, his fortress of solitude, replacing the school bus for babysitting duty. And now it was just as well, because one of the big, scary monsters was heading right for the truck. Slamming it into reverse, Mikey backed the truck away, not bothering to look where he was going. Besides, the side views were all covered in sand. He winced as the truck collided with something. It didn't keep the truck from moving, so he didn't care all that much. Then it slammed into something that jolted him right out of his seat, bringing the truck to a sudden and painful halt. Throwing it back into drive, he floored it. But the truck didn't move. "Come on, come on!" To quote nobody in the world except geeks like him, Mikey put the pedal to the metal, but nothing happened. He could hear the back wheels spinning, probably on sand. Mikey was really learning to hate sand. A rhythmic pounding indicated that the zombies were now taking out their frustrations on the truck itself. Within seconds, and with an ear-splitting rending of metal and shattering of glass, they removed both doors, one window, and an entire side panel. Mikey tried not to think about how impossible it would be to replace the equipment they were shredding, which proved easy, as his primary thoughts were of how he was going to live another 10 seconds. Then he remembered. He had guns! Thanks to Carlos, he even knew how to use them. Bringing up the .22s he'd been entrusted with, Carlos had said that anything more powerful would be unwise. He fired them at the 2 nearest zombies. 4 more took their place. Whirling around, Mikey saw that there were no undead at the rear door. Jumping out of his seat, he made a beeline for the back. He threw the back doors open and ran as fast as he'd ever run in his life. Faster, even, than he had when Butch Mowbray went after him in search of lunch money. And who names their kid Butch anyway? That was his given name on his birth certificate and everything. He'd grown up to be a janitor, which Mikey had always considered poetic justice. Mikey wondered if he survived the apocalypse. He hoped not. Something crashed into Mikey's back, and he fell to the floor, hated, evil sand getting into his nose, mouth, and eyes. The weight on him was tremendous, and for the first time in his life, Mikey understood the term dead weight. A big woman zombie rolled Mikey over and craned her mouth open, ready to feed on him. Then her head exploded. Looking past the decapitated zombie, Mikey saw Claire holding a smoking gun. "Mikey, over here!" she screamed. As if he had to be told twice. Mikey had been secretly in love with Claire Redfield from the moment he first met her, but hadn't said anything, burned as he'd been by a lifetime of rejection. But he swore if he got out of this alive, he was asking her to marry him. Clambering to his feet, Mikey ran toward the Hummer, even as Claire turned and shot another zombie. Then another impact, this on his side, and another, and another. Overwhelming agony, worse than anything Butch had inflicted on him in an entire childhood of bullying torture, racked Mikey's body as the zombies literally ripped him apart. His last thoughts were of Claire. The last thing he heard was Kmart calling his name. Kmart would have thought that after all the people she'd seen die, she'd get used to it. As she watched the monster zombies tear Mikey, poor sweet Mikey, who never hurt another human being in his entire life, to pieces. After having seen them do the same to Cliff, Pablo, and Morgan, she realized that she hadn't. And this less than a day after losing Otto, Betty, Dylan, and the others. Kmart didn't think she could take any more heartbreak. Whirling around, she stared into the milky white eyes and open mouth of LJ. LJ had turned into a zombie. Screaming, Kmart tried to bring around her shotgun. Oh God, how could she shoot LJ? How? But it was too cramped. LJ leaned in to bite her, and she scrambled back, forced to abandon the shotgun. Then another pair of hands grabbed her from below. At first she thought it was another zombie, but it was just Carlos. Climbing up through the hole in the floor, he pushed Kmart out of the way, and then LJ bit him in the shoulder. Carlos screamed, and so did Kmart. Raising his .45, Carlos shot LJ in the face. LJ's head snapped back, and he slumped in the front seat. Kmart couldn't believe it. LJ was the one who'd first called her Kmart. He'd been the one who always joked, always had a story for the kids, the one who kept them going. He couldn't be dead. He just couldn't. She turned to look at Carlos, whom she had to admit to having a huge crush on, though that seemed immature and stupid right now. He had a big wound in his shoulder. He was going to die too. Bile rising in her throat, Kmart realized that they were all going to die here in this place that Alice said used to be a fun town. Chapter 26. Alice fought. It had been a while since Detroit, which was the last time that the Umbrella Corporation had her under their control. It had been a while since she had to fight them. Last time, she hadn't been able to do it until after they made her kill Angie Ashford. This time, she fought harder. Alice had already been a hard woman, forged by her years in the Treasury, and as head of security for the Hive, tempered by the years since the T-virus spread, both through the earth and through her veins. She would not let herself be subject to Isaac's whims ever again. For all the people who died in the Hive, from the 500 employees to one and his commando team, for Matt and Lisa, crusaders who wanted to bring Umbrella down, for the entire population of Raccoon City sacrificed on Umbrella's altar of superiority, for the people of this convoy who'd given their lives in an attempt to survive, and for Angie. Her eyes still worked, and she watched as the monsters tore the news truck apart, and then did the same to Mikey. She watched as LJ turned and Carlos shot him in the face. She watched as 4 more of the undead headed toward the ambulance, Peter, Michael, and Joel managing to kill all 4 with their pistols, but not before one of them literally tore Peter Michael's head off. She watched Dorian and Erica run toward the Eiffel Tower, hoping it would provide the same sanctuary that it had for Chase. One of the undead grabbed Erica's leg, sending her crashing to the ground, killing her instantly. Dorian, wisely, kept running. Alice could do nothing, so she fought. Pinto frowned. "Sir?" Isaacs had been discussing the latest version of the formula with Margolin when Pinto interrupted. "What is it?" "She's fighting the conditioning." Damn it. He had been afraid of this. "Boost the control signal." Her EEG was now flying about like mad. Pinto nodded and typed more commands in. Then the image on the plasma screen jumped and faded away, replaced with the words, "Satellite offline." The other monitors went to static. "What is it?" Isaacs asked angrily. Shaking her head, Pinto entered some commands, then pounded the keyboard in frustration. She shifted her chair over to another control station. "It's the satellite, some kind of malfunction." Turning around, she said, "It's not like we've been able to do maintenance on the things." "Can you move another satellite into place?" Nodding, Pinto said, "Already on it. Satellite 5 will be in place in 6 minutes. Tensely, Isaacs watched the technician work. The seconds ticked by agonizingly. Luckily, he'd already gotten authorization from Wesker for this operation, so Pinto's commands would be automatically authorized without the need for oversight. Moving a satellite would have taken far longer otherwise. After Isaacs was certain 6 minutes had passed, he testily asked, "How long?" "New feed coming online in 15 seconds. Perhaps it was only 5 minutes and 45 seconds. Isaac sighed. He didn't mind waiting, but he hated not knowing. Alice felt control come back to her limbs. She'd done it. It had taken all her focus, but she'd concentrated on the umbrella satellite that was monitoring them and managed to burn out just one microchip. Such a small chip, yet destroying it had such catastrophic consequences. At least they were catastrophic if your name was Sam Isaacs. For Alice, it was liberation. She raised her kukris and looked at the undead that remained. She smiled. "I think you boys are looking for me." If you had told Chase McAvoy 10 years ago that he'd be hanging off the Eiffel Tower in Vegas, shooting at horror movie rejects that had murdered several of his closest friends, he'd have sent you to the rubber room, or at least put you under arrest. He'd been able to do that during his all-too-brief tenure as a county sheriff in Texas. That reign had been brief, ended by a scandal that had been caused by an error in judgment on Chase's part. That error was in thinking that the quarterback on the high school football team wasn't above the law. The state religion in Texas was football, and nobody messed with that. If the quarterback raped and killed one of the cheerleaders, well, that was a tragedy, true, but the state championships were coming up. Chase hadn't seen it that way, and he'd put the quarterback under arrest. Suddenly, there were pictures. They'd been photoshopped, but try explaining that to an angry populace who wanted their star quarterback on the field. And besides, that little slut was asking for it, wearing that short skirt and tight sweater. After the special election kicked him out of office, Chase got in his truck and drove north. When he crossed the border into Oklahoma, he swore he'd never set foot in the great state of Texas again. Thus far, he'd kept that vow, though at this point he had a certain interest in heading back there to see if any of his fellow townsfolk were still alive. Chase hoped they weren't, and he hoped they died in considerable pain. But he could be a vindictive greaseball when he put his mind to it. Now, though, Texas and quarterbacks and sheriff's duties were the last thing on his mind. Dorian and Erica had been chased all over the strip. They caught Erica, but Dorian was now climbing up the tower. 7 of the big scary monsters were climbing up after her, and Chase could not get a good shot. He winged the tower a bunch of times, hit shoulders and chests, but couldn't get himself a headshot, and nothing short of a headshot would kill these creeps. That Alice dame came out of nowhere, then, and threw something at 4 of the monsters, hitting them right in the back. Whatever they were, they worked. As the 4 of them fell to the ground, Alice then leapt away faster and farther than people were supposed to and landed on the tower. She started to climb. Just as Dorian was getting near Chase, one of the monsters grabbed her ankle. Bending over as far as he could without losing his grip on the metal rod, Chase inserted the muzzle of his gun into the monster's mouth and pulled the trigger. "Climb," he said before the gun's blast finished echoing. Nodding, Dorian climbed past him. Chase tried to shoot the other 2, but they moved too damn fast. He wasn't used to that. The monsters were supposed to be slow. One of them grabbed his leg and pulled, yanking Chase hard enough for him to lose his grip. As he fell toward the ground, he decided that this was a crappy way to die. Alice watched as Chase fell past her, then climbed faster. The final 2 undead were almost on top of Dorian, and Alice was determined to save somebody's life today. She did a flying leap across the beams, slicing through one of the undead as she landed. The other one was grabbing a screaming Dorian, and Alice took care of him, too. The 4 pieces of what was once 2 undead fell to the ground, landing right next to the 3 undead who were feasting on Chase's corpse. From her vantage point, Alice realized that these were the only 3 left. Carlos and Claire ran out of their respective vehicles and took on those last 3, blowing their heads off. Too late, sadly, for Chase. She looked around and saw 35 undead bodies around the strip. There had been 36, but she didn't see any sign of the last one. Her view wasn't complete. Perhaps it was under a truck or a sand dune. At least, she hoped so. Turning to Dorian, Alice asked, "You okay?" Dorian stared at her. "You're kidding me, right?" She shook her head. "I'm alive. That's as okay as I'm likely to get. Jesus." "Come on, let's get down." Slowly but surely, Alice could have gone faster, but she went at Dorian's pace. They climbed down the Eiffel Tower. Before she and Dorian even landed, Claire asked, "What the hell were those?" "There's only one company depraved enough to experiment on the undead," Alice said, "and they're also the only company that can control me even for a minute." Control you? Remember when I said they did something to me? Alice asked, which got her a nod from Claire. They can control my mind sometimes. They did it for a few minutes during the fight, but I managed to break it. She looked around. I might have been able to save Chase, Erica, and Peter Michael if... Carlos held up his hand. No. We're not responsible. They are. He shook his head. Umbrella. The world's gone to hell, and they find a way to make it worse. Alice tried to smile, but couldn't. Should be the company's slogan. So now what? Claire asked. She looked around. The ambulance's engine had been smashed by the creatures. The news truck was a complete wreck. And the Hummer and 8x8 were in pretty bad shape. Even if there was gas in the Venetian Hotel, there wasn't much left to put it in. The Enco tanker was the only vehicle that was still more or less intact. Now Alice could smile, but it was a nasty one. Oh, I have some thoughts in that regard. Give me a second. She concentrated, sending her mind outward. It wasn't something she'd done very often. But luckily, she knew what she was looking for, and there weren't very many active minds in the area. Then she found it. Bingo. Running toward the Venetian's parking garage, she said, "Follow me." Behind her, she heard Claire tell Dorian to go to the ambulance and help Joel watch the kids. Carlos, Claire, and Kmart followed her, though Alice put considerable distance between herself and them in short order. Eventually, she slowed down enough so that she stayed in eyesight of the other three. She ran up the parking garage's stairs on the far end, reached the roof, and ran across. There it was, an umbrella tent and an umbrella helicopter. Just as she was about to jump down to the ground, she felt it. They were trying to regain control. Forget that. She gripped the kukris by the blade, the edges slicing into her skin, the pain giving her more focus. There wouldn't be another life she couldn't save because Isaacs was screwing with her mind. There wouldn't be another Erica, another Chase, another Peter Michael. There wouldn't be another Angie. Jumping down from the parking garage, she landed on the ground, bending her knees with the impact. She could feel them trying to take control, but she would not let them. As she ran toward the tent, she could hear voices. "She's still coming. Shut her down, damn it. I'm trying, but there's interference. Boost the control signal. It's already at max. She's resisting command protocols." None of the voices belonged to Isaacs. Ripping open the tent, she saw 4 people. She recognized one of the security guards, Paul DeGennaro. He'd been the one shouting to shut her down, but she didn't know the other security guard, the man in the lab coat, or the woman at the computer station. The security guard she didn't know raised a machine gun. Alice threw a kukri right at his chest. As he died, impaled on the support pole behind him, his finger spasmed on his weapon's trigger, which was apparently set to automatic, and bullets sprayed all across the tent, taking out computers and screens, and killing the technician and DeGennaro instantly. The man in the lab coat was also shot, but not dead yet. Alice grabbed him by the throat. "Where is he?" Then she heard the whirl of helicopter blades. Damn it! She dropped the dying doctor to the floor and ran out. 12 seconds after she said she'd have the satellite online in 15 seconds, Pinto said, "Online in 3, 2, 1. One of the plasma screens flickered to life. Isaacs, pleased with his foresight in bringing Pinto along, immediately scanned the screens for signs of Alice, or anyone. All he saw were unmoving bodies, including what appeared to be almost all, if not all, of the super undead. Plenty of human corpses as well, but none was Project Alice. "Damn it, where is she?" Pinto said. "Live feed from Project Alice coming online now." Isaacs nodded in satisfaction. The so-called Alice cam would do the trick. The other plasma screen lit up to show the interior of a parking garage. Tarnished signs that had worn into illegibility were visible on the walls. "Where the hell is she going?" Isaacs asked. She turned and ran up a flight of stairs, putting her on the roof of the garage. Then she looked out and down at this very tent. "Oh, no," Pinto said, a sentiment Isaacs could get behind. "Shut her down, now!" But even as Pinto entered commands, Isaacs knew that it was over. Alice had already broken the programming several times, and he simply could not trust that she wouldn't do it this time. Turning to De Janeiro, he said, "Stop her," and left the tent before he could say anything. He ran straight for the helicopter. As he climbed aboard, he said to Kistler, "Back to the base, now." "But what about—" Kistler started, but Isaacs ignored him and turned to close the door behind him. As he did so, a meaty hand grabbed his arm. Looking up, he saw Gretzky. This was a complication Isaacs did not need. Before Isaacs could do or say anything, Gretzky leaned in and bit into Isaacs' shoulder. Sam Isaacs had lived the sedentary life of a scientist. Oh, he'd felt pain before, of course, most notably when Project Alice had broken his arm and thrown him into a tank. That arm still throbbed occasionally, particularly when the air conditioning in the facility malfunctioned, or when it rained. This pain was several orders of magnitude worse than anything he'd ever felt before. A deafening report from a machine gun cut through the pain, and Gretzky's head exploded a second later. Perrineau had shot the super undead. Isaacs could feel his grip on consciousness eluding him, and he gritted his teeth, trying to force himself awake. He let Perrineau guide him inside the helicopter, and then, after closing the door, the security guard applied a pressure bandage to his wound. Somehow, Isaacs made his lips move. "The antivirus. Get me the antivirus." He couldn't tell if the words he spoke were comprehensible or not. Apparently they were. Perrineau moved Isaac's own hand to the pressure bandage. Then she reached down under one of the seats to pull out an emergency first aid kit. She pulled out a hypo filled with the beautiful green of the antivirus and injected Isaacs with it. As Kistler took off, Perrineau moved to the front of the helicopter. Once she was out of sight, Isaacs lifted the pressure bandage. The bleeding had stopped, far sooner than it should have, given the severity of the injury, and the wound was already starting to itch, indicating the healing process. Isaacs smiled.